The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday Adelaide Ellsworth was on a train heading west with 2 leather trunks, a hat box, and the particular kind of dread that settles into a woman's chest when she realizes her entire future has been arranged without her input. She was 22 years old, possessed of auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, a sharp tongue she had spent years learning to soften for polite company, and a mind that her mother had always called too active for her own good. She had read every book in her father's modest library in their Boston townhouse, had opinions about literature and economics and the proper way to brew tea, and she had never once in her life been asked what she wanted for herself. Not in any meaningful way, not the way it counted. The telegram had come from her uncle, Charles Ellsworth, who served as a kind of long-distance patriarch for the family, since Adelaide's father had passed 3 years prior from a fever that took him quickly and without ceremony. Charles had settled in the Arizona Territory a decade back, made a decent life for himself in a town called Redrock Flats, and he had apparently decided in his benevolent and meddling wisdom that his niece needed a husband, and that the right man for the job was one Mr. Harlan Boone, the sole banker in Redrock Flats, a widower of 41 who owned the only brick building in town and who came, according to Charles's letter, highly recommended by the entire community. Adelaide had read the letter 3 times. Then she had sat very still in the parlor while her mother cried with relief and talked about security and propriety, and how a woman of Adelaide's situation, without a father and with only a modest inheritance, could not afford to be particular. Her mother was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one, and Adelaide understood the difference even when the words stung. So she had packed her trunks. She had kissed her mother's cheek. She had stepped onto the train in Boston with the posture of a woman who had decided to be brave about something she had not chosen, and she had been riding west ever since, through cities that gradually thinned into towns, through towns that thinned into open land so vast and golden and breathtaking that it made her press her forehead against the train window and forget, for stretches of time, that she was terrified. The Arizona Territory in the spring of 1882 was a wild and particular kind of beautiful. The desert bloomed in colors she had no names for, pale lavender and hot orange, and the sky went on forever in every direction like God had simply refused to stop painting. Adelaide had been raised on descriptions of the West as a dangerous and lawless place, and perhaps parts of it were, but looking at that enormous sky, she also thought it looked like freedom, which was a word she had been trying not to think too hard about lately. The train was due to arrive in Redrock Flats at 11 in the morning. Adelaide knew this because she had been watching the small clock she kept in her travel bag with something approaching obsession. When the conductor passed through and announced they were 30 minutes out, she smoothed her green traveling dress, repinned her hair 3 times unsuccessfully, and decided that she would conduct herself with grace and dignity regardless of what she found waiting for her on the platform. She was not prepared for what she found. What she found was Orville Vaughn. The train slowed as it approached the Redrock Flats station, which was really just a long wooden platform with a painted sign hanging slightly crooked from a post. Adelaide had gathered her smaller bag and was standing near the door, watching through the window as the platform came into view, when she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, one hand resting on the post, the other holding the reins of a bay horse that stood patiently behind him. He wore a dark hat pulled low against the morning sun, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen a great deal of country. He was looking down the track with the particular alertness of someone who was waiting for something specific. He was, without question, the most striking man Adelaide Ellsworth had ever seen in her 22 years of life. Not in the way that the well-dressed men of Boston were striking, with their pressed coats and careful manners. He was striking the way the landscape was striking, in a way that made something in her chest go very still and then very loud all at once. She told herself this was absurd and stepped off the train. The Arizona heat hit her like something physical, a warm, pressing weight that was entirely different from the dry cold she had left behind in Boston. The platform was busy with the usual activity of an arriving train: men unloading cargo, a few passengers, a woman with a basket of goods that had apparently been sent up from Tucson. Adelaide stood on the platform and looked around for her Uncle Charles, who had written that he would meet her. What she found instead was the man from the end of the platform, who had apparently seen something in her arrival that prompted him to walk over, leading his horse behind him. Up close, he was even more alarming to her composure than he had been from the window. He had dark eyes, the color of good coffee, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days, and he looked at her with a directness that she was not accustomed to from men who had not yet been introduced. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors where there was no one to rush him. Adelaide straightened her spine. "I am, and you are." "Orville Vaughn," he said, and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was courteous without being formal. "Your uncle sent me. He got held up this morning, something with a fence line on the east pasture. He asked me to come meet your train and bring you to town." Adelaide looked at him for a moment. "He sent a cowboy to collect me." "Yes, ma'am," Orville said without any particular offense in his voice. "He did." "I see." She looked at the horse, then back at him. "And am I meant to ride that horse?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it. "No, ma'am. I've got a wagon around the other side of the station. The horse is just mine. He goes where I go." "Of course he does," Adelaide said, more to herself than to him, and picked up her bag. He helped her with her trunks without being asked, which she noted. He loaded them into the back of a wagon with efficiency and no complaint, even though the larger trunk was quite heavy and she had perhaps overpacked. He helped her up onto the wagon seat and then climbed up beside her, and they moved off down the main street of Redrock Flats in the late morning sun, the bay horse trotting alongside them on a long lead. Adelaide looked at the town as they passed through it. It was smaller than she had imagined, though she was not sure exactly what she had imagined. There was a long main street with a general store, a post office, a saloon with its doors propped open, a barber, a small church at the far end, and yes, one brick building that sat squarely in the middle of everything like a man who was very sure of his own importance. A painted sign above the door read BOONE Bank and Trust. She looked at it without speaking. "That's the bank," Orville said, because apparently he had noticed her looking. "I gathered," she said. There was a silence that was not entirely comfortable. "Mr. Vaughn," she said after a moment, "how long have you worked for my uncle?" "About 3 years," he said. "I help run his cattle operation." "Your uncle has about 400 head, good land, decent water access. It's honest work. You sound like you respect it." "I do," he said simply. "I was raised on a ranch in Texas. Cattle work is what I know." Adelaide turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead, hands easy on the reins, the morning light catching the line of his profile. He was, she thought, somewhere around 26 or 27, though there was a self-possession about him that made him seem older. Not in a tired way, in a settled way, like a man who had figured out something fundamental about himself and was comfortable in the knowledge. "And are you from around here, then? Or did you come west as my uncle did?" "Came up from Texas about 4 years ago," he said. "Worked a cattle drive, then another, then settled here when your uncle offered steady work. Redrock Flats is a good town, mostly." "Mostly," she repeated. "Every town has its complications," he said. She thought about the brick bank building. "I imagine so." They arrived at her uncle's ranch about a mile outside of town, a modest but solid affair with a main house, a barn, 2 corrals, and the particular organized chaos of a working cattle operation. Charles Ellsworth came out to meet them with his hat in his hand and apology written all over his weathered face. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s with kind eyes and a manner that reminded Adelaide strongly of her father, which made her chest hurt a little when she first saw him. "Adelaide, my dear," he said, taking both her hands. "I am so sorry I couldn't be there myself. We had a section of fence down on the east boundary and 3 head got through and I couldn't leave it half managed. Please forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive, Uncle Charles," she said, and meant it. Mr. Vaughn was very capable. She glanced back at Orville, who was unloading her trunks from the wagon with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He caught her look briefly, and she turned back to her uncle before she could give herself time to analyze what she was feeling. Charles showed her to her room, which was small but clean, and had a window that looked out over the desert toward a row of low red mountains in the distance. She stood at that window for a long time after he left her to settle in, watching the light move across those mountains, and thought about the fact that she was here now, and that tomorrow or the next day she would be introduced to Harlan Boone, the banker, the widower, the owner of the only brick building in Redrock Flats, and that her life was apparently to be arranged around that meeting. She did not cry. She was not particularly a woman who cried when she was unhappy. She was more likely to go very quiet and very determined, which her mother had always said was far more alarming in its own way. Dinner that evening was a revelation. Charles's cook, a formidable Mexican woman named Dona Esperanza, who had been with him for 8 years and ran the household with benevolent iron-fisted authority, produced a meal of roasted chicken, rice, beans, and fresh bread that made Adelaide understand for the first time that food could be something other than fuel. She said so aloud, and Dona Esperanza laughed with her whole body and told her in a mix of Spanish and English that she was going to feed her properly since she looked like the journey had eaten her alive. Orville was at dinner as well, which Adelaide had not expected. He sat at the end of the table across from her and ate with quiet appetite, and spoke when Charles spoke to him, and was careful and respectful to Dona Esperanza in a way that Adelaide watched with more attention than she intended to give it. Charles clearly valued him, referring to him in the casual way of a man who trusted the person across from him completely. When he mentioned fence lines or cattle counts or water rights, he looked at Orville, and Orville had answers specific and considered. "Adelaide," Charles said, pouring himself a second cup of coffee after the meal, "I've sent word to Harlan Boone that you've arrived safely. He's hoping to call tomorrow afternoon if you're rested enough from the journey." Adelaide set down her fork with great care. "Of course," she said. Orville, across the table, had gone very still. She noticed because she had been noticing things about him all evening without meaning to. "He's a fine man," Charles said, with the particular emphasis of a man who was trying to be convincing. "He's done well for himself out here. He's solid, respectable. He'll give you a good home, Adelaide." "I'm sure he will," she said. After dinner she excused herself early and went to sit on the front porch in the cooling desert air, which smelled of dust and something floral she couldn't identify, and the distant wood smoke of the ranch hand's cookfire. The stars were extraordinary. She had not known there could be so many of them, or that they could be so bright. Boston's sky was always dimmed by city light, and she had thought she knew what stars looked like. She had been wrong. She heard boots on the porch boards and turned to find Orville coming around the side of the house, heading for the barn. He stopped when he saw her. "Evening, Miss Ellsworth," he said. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," she said. "What are the stars like in Texas? Are they the same?" He paused, looking up. "Similar. Texas sky is a little flatter. More of them seem to come right down to the horizon. But the Arizona sky has more color to the dark, like it goes deeper somehow." She looked up with him. "I didn't know you could tell the difference. You notice things when you spend enough time outside at night," he said. He was leaning against the porch post now, comfortable, not forcing conversation but not leaving either. "How are you doing, Miss Ellsworth? It's a long journey you made." "I'm fine," she said, and then, because something about that enormous sky and his quiet manner made the polite automatic answer feel insufficient, she said, "I'm nervous, if I'm being honest." "About Mr. Boone," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "Is it that obvious?" "Maybe not to everyone," he said. "But I've been watching people on this ranch for 3 years. You get good at reading what someone isn't saying. She considered this. And what am I not saying? He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he was going to deflect, to say something polite and non-committal and go to the barn. But instead he said, that you didn't come out here because you wanted to, that you came because it was what was expected of you. The words sat between them in the dark and the starlight. Adelaide turned back to look at the mountains, which were barely visible now as shapes against the deeper dark. My father always said I was too stubborn to be managed, she said. But it turns out you can be both stubborn and out of options. Those aren't mutually exclusive, he said. She laughed, surprising herself. It was a real laugh, not the careful social kind. No, I suppose they aren't, he straightened. I should get back to the barn, got to check on the horses before I turn in. But Miss Ellsworth, he paused. The stars here are worth the trip at least. She looked up again. Yes, she agreed. They really are. He said goodnight and walked to the barn, and she sat on the porch for a long time afterward with her hands folded in her lap and something unfamiliar turning over slowly in her chest. The next afternoon, Harlan Boone came to call. He arrived at precisely 2 o'clock in an actual buggy with a matched pair of gray horses, which was not the sort of thing you saw in Redrock Flats every day, and the message of it was not subtle. He was a heavy-set man of middling height with graying side whiskers and the careful grooming of someone who was very conscious of his own standing. He wore a good suit, which was impressive given the heat. His hands were soft. Adelaide noticed his hands because she had always thought you could tell a great deal about a person from their hands, and Harlan Boone's hands said that he had not done physical work in quite some time, that he was accustomed to having things done for him. He was not an unkind man, she thought, as they sat in the parlor with Charles hovering nearby and Dona Esperanza producing coffee and small cakes. He was formal and careful in the way of someone who had rehearsed this meeting, who was aware that the situation had a particular social delicacy to it. He asked her about Boston in the polite way of someone who had no real interest in Boston. He told her about Redrock Flats in the careful way of someone presenting a proposal. He talked about the bank, the house he owned on the good side of town, the fact that he had a garden, as though the garden were a selling point. Adelaide listened with her hands folded and her face composed and her mind completely elsewhere. No, not elsewhere, very specifically somewhere. On a man who had met her train that morning and talked about the color of the dark. She was deeply alarmed by herself. Miss Ellsworth, Harlan Boone said, I want you to know that I am a straightforward man. My first wife, God rest her, passed 4 years ago. The fever. I have a house that needs a woman's management, and I believe, from what your uncle has told me, that you are a sensible and capable young woman. I am not a poet. I won't pretend to sentiments I don't have. But I would offer you a comfortable life. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes with the confidence of a man who genuinely expected a yes, not from cruelty, but from the simple, unchallenged assumption that what he was offering was self-evidently good enough. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Boone, she said carefully. I thought we might ride out tomorrow, he said, and I could show you the house. It's newly painted. That would be very kind, she said. After he left, Charles found her on the front porch again, which she was beginning to understand was where she went when she needed to think. He's a good man, Adelaide, her uncle said, with the sincere conviction of someone who believed it. I know he is, she said. He'll take care of you. Yes, she said, he will. Charles sat beside her in the other chair. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same desert, the same mountains, the same enormous western sky. Your father would have wanted you to be cared for, he said. Adelaide closed her eyes briefly. My father would have wanted me to be happy, Uncle Charles. They are not always the same thing. Charles was silent for a moment. Then he said, with the particular quietness of a man who was hearing something for the first time even though it had been true all along, No, I suppose they're not. That evening at dinner, Orville was late. He came in dusty and tired from what Charles said had been a full day of moving cattle to the north pasture. He washed up at the pump outside and came in with his dark hair damp at the temples and sat down across from Adelaide with the weary ease of a man running on the last of his energy. He ate quietly and listened to Charles talk about Boone's visit, and when Charles said it had gone well, Orville looked at Adelaide across the table with those dark coffee eyes, and she was very careful to look away first. After dinner, he was in the barn when Adelaide went out to get some air. She did not go to the barn. She sat on the fence by the small corral instead and watched the horses move in the moonlight. But Orville came out of the barn after a while and saw her there and leaned against the fence a few feet away. "How was the meeting?" he said. "Informative," she said. He was quiet, which was one of the things she was beginning to appreciate about him. He did not fill silence with words just to avoid the discomfort of it. He seemed entirely comfortable letting a silence be what it was. "He talked about his garden," Adelaide said finally. "His house is newly painted." Orville made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I know it sounds ungrateful," she said quickly. "It doesn't," he said. "It sounds honest." She turned to look at him. He was watching the horses. The moonlight caught the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the patient way he held himself against the fence. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, and stopped. "Orville," he said, still looking at the horses. "You can call me Orville if you want. Mr. Vaughn sounds like someone's school teacher." She almost smiled. "Orville, can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." She thought about how to put it. "Did you ever want something you weren't supposed to want? Something that was outside what people expected of you?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I grew up in a sharecropping family in East Texas. My father wanted me to take over the land when he got too old to work it. I wanted to be anywhere that had open sky. I left when I was 18. He paused. "My father didn't speak to me for 2 years after that." Adelaide looked at him. "I'm sorry." "He wrote eventually," Orville said. "We made our peace. He died when I was 23, but those 2 years," he shook his head slowly. "I used to wonder if I'd made the right choice, going against what everyone expected." "Did you decide you had?" He finally looked at her, and the steadiness of his gaze made something shift in her chest. "Yes," he said, "because the alternative was spending your whole life being someone you weren't meant to be. And that seemed like a worse kind of slow death." The words landed in her like stones in still water, sending out rings in every direction. She was quiet for a long time. "I should go in," she said finally. "Good night, Miss Ellsworth." "Adelaide," she said, "if we're being honest about names." Something in his face changed very slightly, barely perceptible, like the shift of light when a cloud moves past the sun. "Good night, Adelaide," he said. She went inside and lay in her bed for a very long time, staring at the ceiling with her heart doing things she had no useful framework for. The next day she went to see Harlan Boone's house. It was, objectively, a very nice house. 2 stories, which was unusual for this part of the territory. The new paint he had mentioned was a clean white with dark green shutters, and there was indeed a garden, a small rectangle of cultivated earth in front where roses were being wrestled into existence despite the climate. The interior was well furnished, if somewhat impersonal, the house of a man who had money but no particular sense of what a home was supposed to feel like. The rooms were tidy because he had a Mexican woman who came 3 days a week to clean and cook, and he mentioned this as another selling point. Adelaide walked through the house with her hands behind her back and her thoughts carefully managed, and she thought, "I could live here. I could make it pleasant. I could do what is expected of me and be grateful that it is not worse." And somewhere at the back of her mind, very quietly but very persistently, "Is that enough?" On the drive back to Charles's ranch in Boone's buggy, he said, "I would like to call formally at the end of the week if you're agreeable. We could discuss terms." "I've already spoken with your uncle. He mentioned it," she said. "I'd like to make it official by the month's end," he said. "The minister can perform the ceremony." Adelaide looked out at the desert passing beside the road. A hawk was circling high above the flat-topped mesas, riding the thermals with effortless patience. "Mr. Boone," she said slowly, "I wonder if I might have a little more time to acclimatize. I've only just arrived." He looked at her with the faint expression of a man to whom waiting had not occurred as a necessary part of the process. "Of course," he said after a moment. "Of course, a week perhaps." "A week," she agreed. "That seems reasonable." He delivered her back to the ranch with courtesy and left promptly, and Adelaide stood on the porch watching the buggy go back toward town. Behind her she heard the particular creak of the barn door and did not turn around. She had a week. She spent those days learning the ranch. She could not simply sit in her room waiting for the week to end, and Charles seemed pleased by her interest in the operation, happy to show her around, to explain the work. She went with him to check the water troughs, to watch the cattle sorting, to observe the daily rhythm of the land. She found she liked the work, or at least the watching of it. There was something deeply satisfying about labor that had clear and visible results. And Orville was everywhere the ranch work was, which she told herself was simply a coincidence of geography and had nothing to do with the way she found reasons to be wherever the ranch work was happening. He showed her how to read the brand marks on the cattle. He explained why the north pasture had better grass than the south pasture, something to do with the way the land held water after the winter. He told her about the cattle drives he had ridden when he was younger, the long routes up from Texas with hundreds of head and a crew of a dozen men, and nothing but sky and dust, and the sound of hooves for weeks on end. He told these stories without embellishment, simply and specifically, and she listened with a hunger that she recognized had very little to do with cattle and everything to do with the person telling her about them. On the third day, she helped Dona Esperanza make bread because she had asked to learn, and Dona Esperanza had looked her up and down with the assessing eyes of a woman who had survived much and respected capability, and said simply, "Good, I will show you." Adelaide had flour on her hands and a smear of it on her cheek when Orville came in to get water from the kitchen pump, and he looked at her in that almost smiling way and said not a word, which somehow made it worse. "You have something," he said, touching his own cheekbone. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and got more flour on it, which made Dona Esperanza laugh, which made Adelaide laugh. And she was laughing when she looked up and found Orville watching her with an expression that was not almost smiling anymore but something else entirely, something warmer and more vulnerable that he quickly tucked away, but not before she had seen it. She thought about that look for the rest of the day and most of the night. On the fourth day, she found him behind the barn fixing a length of broken fence, with the focused competence of someone who had fixed a great many fences. She brought him a cup of coffee because she had been in the kitchen when Dona Esperanza made it, and it seemed like a natural thing to do. He looked at the coffee and then at her with slight surprise, like she had done something unexpected. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was in the kitchen," she said. "It wasn't an effort." He took the cup and drank and went back to the fence. She sat on a nearby rock in the shade of the barn wall. It was mid-morning and the heat was already serious. A lizard regarded her from a nearby flat stone. "Orville," she said. "Adelaide," he answered, hammering a staple into the post without looking up. "What is Harlan Boone like, in town? What do people think of him?" He was quiet for a moment, working the fence. "He's a businessman," he said carefully. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. He set down the hammer and looked at her. "He's not a bad man. He's careful with money, which in a town like this is both a virtue and a problem depending on which side of the loan you're on. He's not cruel. He follows the rules that benefit him and finds ways around the ones that don't. He's the most powerful man in Redrock Flats and he knows it, and mostly he uses that power reasonably." He paused. "But he's never been the kind of man who would wonder if the rules were fair in the first place." Adelaide absorbed this. "And you think about that, whether the rules are fair. I think you can't grow up in East Texas in a poor family in the 1860s without thinking about it," he said. "I've seen what happens to people when the rules are made by the people who benefit most from them." She looked at him carefully. "You're a more complex person than most people probably assume when they see you fixing a fence." "Most people don't look very hard," he said. The tone was not bitter, just factual. "I'm looking," she said, and then felt the blood rise in her face because it had come out with rather more directness than she had intended. He looked at her for a long moment, and the desert morning was very quiet around them. "I know," he said softly. She stood up and said she should get back to the house and walked away with as much dignity as she could manage while her heart was conducting itself like a runaway horse. That evening, just before sunset, something happened that Adelaide would think about for the rest of her life as the moment when she understood that something was shifting in her life with the inexorability of weather. She had gone for a walk along the near edge of the ranch, where a dry creek bed carved a gentle path through the desert scrub, because she needed air and quiet and space to think. The sunset was happening in spectacular fashion, as Arizona sunsets did, great banners of orange and crimson, and a particular shade of deep rose that had no name she knew. She had stopped at the edge of the creek bed and was watching it when she heard hooves, and Orville came along the creek bed on the bay horse, riding easy, probably coming back from checking the north pasture. He saw her and slowed and stopped. They looked at each other with the sunset happening between them and around them. He stepped down from the horse without saying anything and came to stand beside her, and they both stood looking at the sunset. After a while he said, "What are you going to do?" She did not pretend to misunderstand. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," he said quietly. "You knew before you asked for the week." She closed her eyes. The warm desert wind moved against her face and pushed a strand of hair across her cheek. "What I know and what I can reasonably do are two different things," she said. "I came here on a train with my uncle's promise to Harlan Boone already made. My mother is in Boston counting on this match to secure the family's position. I have almost nothing of my own." "I know," he said. "And I have known you for 4 days," she said. "I know that too." She opened her eyes and looked at him. The light was extraordinary, making everything golden and exact. "So it would be madness," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "It doesn't make sense. Sense and truth are different things sometimes." She felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, but the way ice breaks in spring, suddenly and with a sound like relief. "Orville," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "I cannot marry Harlan Boone." He let out a slow breath. "I know," he said. "I've known it since I watched you get off that train and look at this town with those eyes of yours. You barely know me." "I know you well enough," he said. "I know you read everything. I know you think twice as fast as most people in any room. I know you came out here because you were told to, and you've been unhappy about it in that particular quiet way you have, where you get very still and very polite. I know that you asked me to call you Adelaide instead of Miss Ellsworth on the second night you were here. And I know that you brought me coffee. You didn't have to bring me and sat on a rock and asked me questions because you were trying to understand who I was." He paused. "And I know that when you laugh for real, not the polite kind, it's the best sound in about 50 miles. Adelaide was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The sunset deepened, and the first stars began to appear at the edge of the sky. "I don't know what we do about it," she said. "I know what I want to do about it," he said, "but I'm not going to press you into anything. That wouldn't be right. You've already had enough of your choices made for you." She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want?" "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you'll let me. No promises beyond that right now, just a chance for you to know me better, for me to know you better. And Harlan Boone." "He doesn't have a ring on you yet," Orville said. "And your uncle listens to me. I can talk to him. He'll be angry with you, probably," he said. "He won't be the first man angry with me." Something so warm moved through her that she had to look away. She looked at the stars beginning to multiply above them, and she thought about the train from Boston and the telegram and her mother's frightened eyes, and the long journey and the feeling of watching a hawk ride thermals above the red rock mesas, effortlessly, as though freedom were simply a matter of knowing how to use the air you were given. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "Court me," she said. "Properly." He smiled then, a real one, and it was the first time she had seen it, and it was, she thought, completely unfair. The next morning he spoke to Charles before breakfast. Adelaide knew because she heard voices in the study, low and serious, and then a long silence, and then her uncle's voice raised briefly, and then quiet again, And then Orville came out and Charles came out after him looking like a man who had been handed a problem he had not anticipated. Charles came to find her at the kitchen table where she was having coffee with Dona Esperanza. "Adelaide," he said, sitting down heavily across from her. "Orville tells me you don't wish to proceed with the arrangement." Dona Esperanza suddenly found urgent business elsewhere in the kitchen that still somehow kept her within earshot. "That's correct," Adelaide said. Charles rubbed his face. "Adelaide, I've already spoken with Harlan. I've given him my word as your guardian." "I understand that," she said, "and I am sorry for any awkwardness it causes you, truly. But you are not my guardian, Uncle Charles. You are my uncle and I respect you enormously, but my father never appointed you legal guardian. You made an arrangement without my consent, and I did not agree to it when you wrote to my mother, and I do not agree to it now." Charles opened his mouth and closed it again. "I intend to stay here," she continued, "if you'll have me. I'll earn my keep. I can help Dona Esperanza, I can help with the books if you need it, I can do useful work. I am not going back to Boston. But I will not marry a man I do not want to marry simply because it is convenient for everyone around me." There was a long silence. Then Charles said quietly, "Orville." "I like him," she said directly. "I know that is extremely fast by any reasonable measure, and I am not saying we are engaged or anything near it. I am saying I would like the chance to actually decide something for myself, Uncle Charles. For once." Something in her uncle's face shifted. She watched it happen, watched the frustration and the practical anxiety move aside for something that looked, at its core, like recognition. "Your father said something like that once," he said, almost to himself. "About your mother. He said he'd known in about a week." Adelaide looked down at her coffee. "I told Harlan I'd call on him today," Charles said. "I know, and I'm sorry." Charles was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure about the part where I say no to a man I don't love," she said. "The other part I'm still getting to know." He looked at her for a long moment, this niece who had his brother's eyes and apparently his brother's stubborn particular heart. Then he sighed in the way of a man surrendering something he realizes he was wrong to try to hold. "All right," he said. "All right." Charles rode into town that morning to speak with Harlan Boone. Adelaide did not know exactly what was said, but Charles came back at noon looking tired and a little chastened, and he told her that Boone had taken the news poorly, which she had expected, and that he had said several unflattering things about the quality of women who came from the East, which she had also expected, and that the matter was settled, which was all she needed to hear. That afternoon Orville took her out on horseback. She had not ridden much, mostly sedate park rides in Boston, but he gave her the gentlest horse in the barn, a gray mare named Clover who had the patient and philosophical temperament of a very old and wise animal, and he rode beside her on the bay, and they went out into the open desert at a pace she could manage. The desert revealed itself differently on horseback. She had the sense of actually being in it rather than passing through it, the smell of it more immediate, the scale of it more felt than seen. The saguaro cactus stood around them like enormous patient figures, some of them older than anything she had ever stood next to in Boston, and the desert floor was covered in low flowering plants she still did not know the names of. "What's that one?" she asked, pointing to a low spreading plant with tiny yellow flowers. "Brittlebush," he said. "After a rain it blooms like everything is trying to happen at once." "And that?" "Palo verde. The green bark is how it makes its food when it loses its leaves in the dry season." She looked at him. "How do you know all of this?" "I had some time to learn," he said. "When I first came up from Texas before your uncle hired me, I spent a few months just riding around this territory. I had almost nothing. I slept under the stars more than under a roof. When you're alone in a place long enough, you start paying attention to what's in it. You weren't frightened, alone out here." "Sometimes," he said. "The first few weeks. But then I started to understand that the desert doesn't want to kill you specifically. It's just itself. It's indifferent. And there's something actually comforting about indifference. No malice in it." She thought about this as Clover moved placidly beneath her. "That's a remarkable way to think about it." "You're from a city," he said. "Everything in a city is built to a human scale, purpose and intention everywhere you look. Out here the scale is completely different, it takes some adjusting." "I like it," she said, surprising herself with how completely she meant it. "I didn't expect to like it." He looked at her with that warm, specific attention that she was beginning to think of as particularly his. "I thought you might," he said. "The way you've been watching everything since you got here. Like you were taking notes." "I am always taking notes," she said. "It's a habit." "Tell me something," he said. "Something you noticed that I wouldn't have thought to notice." She considered. "When Dona Esperanza makes the bread," she said, "she hums. Different songs depending on what day of the week it is. Monday is something slow, I think a lullaby. Thursday is faster, almost a dance. I don't know why the days change it, but it does." He was quiet for a moment, as if genuinely thinking about this. "I've heard her hum," he said. "I never paid attention to the pattern." "Most people don't pay attention to the patterns." "You do." "Compulsively," she said. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses' hooves soft on the desert floor, the afternoon light deepening toward the long golden hour that preceded the sunset. Eventually they stopped at the top of a slight rise that gave them a view across a wide basin of desert, the red mountains on the far side, a hawk circling somewhere high above. "Tell me something you noticed," she said, "something you wouldn't have mentioned unless asked." He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "Yesterday evening," he said, "when you came back from Boone's house, you stood on the porch for about 10 minutes before you went inside. You were looking at the mountains. And the way you were standing, not the way you usually stand, your shoulders had come down, like something had decided itself while you weren't paying attention." She stared at him. "You saw that?" "Told you," he said quietly. "I pay attention." She felt that dangerous warmth again spreading out from the center of her chest. She looked away at the wide basin and said, "You are going to be very difficult to think clearly around." "I know," he said, with what she was certain was deliberate calm. "That's probably mutual." She looked back at him, and he was looking at the basin with the slight lift at the corner of his mouth that meant he was somewhere between amused and something else. "Orville," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "This is very fast," she said. "It is," he agreed. "We've known each other less than a week." "I know." Reasonable people would say this is completely impractical. They would. "I am generally a reasonable person," she said. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was full on his face, the dark eyes steady and warm and completely direct. "I know," he said. "Are you talking yourself into this or out of it?" She thought about it for a genuinely honest moment. "Into it," she said. "I think I've been talking myself out of things my entire life. I'm trying something different." Something in his expression opened just slightly, like a door going from almost shut to a little ajar. It was enough. "All right," he said. "Then let's ride back. I'll buy you supper in town if your uncle will spare you for the evening. There's a decent restaurant on Main Street, not fancy, but the pie is excellent." "What kind of pie?" "Peach, from Mrs. Connolly's kitchen. She brings them in on Fridays." "It's Friday," she said. "Yes, ma'am," she laughed, that real laugh. He looked at her with that expression she had learned to watch for, the one he almost tucked away in time but never quite managed. They had supper at the small restaurant on Main Street, which was exactly what he had described, modest but good, and the peach pie was, in fact, remarkable. They sat across a small table from each other and talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say, which Adelaide found was not a common experience. She was accustomed to conversations with men who either wanted to impress her or who ran dry after the weather and current events. Orville talked about books he had read, which surprised her. He had a battered collection that he kept in his bunkhouse room and traded with other ranch hands across the territory. He had opinions about Dickens and no patience whatsoever for any story that condescended to its reader. He talked about the state of the cattle industry, about the coming of the railroads and what it meant for the open range, about the political situation in the territory, and the complicated and unjust history of land that had been taken from the Apache and other peoples who had lived on it for generations. He said this with the direct discomfort of a white man who had thought about it, who knew the history was not clean, who was unwilling to pretend otherwise. Adelaide talked about Boston and her father's library, and the women she had known there who were brilliant and constrained. She talked about the books she loved and why. She talked about the things she wanted that she had not let herself say out loud before, to teach perhaps, or to write, to do something with her mind that felt like using it properly rather than ornamenting someone else's home with it. He listened to everything with complete attention. The way she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world, bringing the same quality of presence to a conversation that he brought to fixing a fence or riding the range. When they walked back to where he had tied the horses, the main street of Redrock Flats was quiet in the evening, the saloon producing its distant sound of piano and voices, the stars enormous overhead. She stopped outside and looked up. "I'm not going to be sorry," she said quietly. He was beside her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm. "About what?" "About saying no to Harlan Boone." She looked at him. "About saying yes to you." The moment was still and warm and charged with everything the past week had been building toward. He reached out slowly and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond the practical courtesy of helping her into a wagon. His hand was warm and calloused and certain. She felt it through her whole body. "You haven't said yes to me about anything specific yet," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I'm working up to it." He smiled, that full, real smile. "Take your time," he said. She did not need as much time as either of them might have expected. The following weeks in Redrock Flats unfolded with the particular quality of a life that is genuinely in the process of becoming something real rather than something arranged. Adelaide learned the ranch, not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as someone who was part of it, who had a place in its rhythms and its work. She helped Donna Esperanza with cooking and the garden, learned to manage the household accounts in a way that satisfied her need for mathematical order, and began taking over correspondence for Charles, who was a better rancher than he was a letter writer. She and Orville fell into a pattern of morning rides before the heat settled in, when the desert was cool and extraordinary and seemed to belong entirely to them. They talked about everything. She read him from books she borrowed from the small collection at the general store, sitting on the porch in the evenings while he repaired tack or mended harness. He taught her the names of the plants and the constellations, and which clouds meant rain and which meant only teasing. She learned that he had a rare quality of steadiness that was not remoteness. He was not a closed-off man. He felt things deeply, she could tell, but he carried them with care, the way you carry something precious that you've learned from experience to be gentle with. He learned that she was funnier than she let most people see, that the sharp tongue her mother had warned her to manage was actually one of the best things about her, quick and precise, and usually aimed at exactly the right target. He learned that she read the way other people breathe, continuously and necessarily, and that she would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence because she was thinking about something she had read 3 years ago that was suddenly relevant. He found this not distracting but wonderful. 3 weeks in, on a Sunday afternoon when Charles had gone into town for church, and Donna Esperanza was visiting her sister, and the ranch was quiet in the hot afternoon, they were sitting in the shade of the big cottonwood by the main corral, Adelaide reading and Orville stretched out on the grass nearby with his hat over his face. She had been reading for a while, and then she set the book down and looked at him lying there in the shade and thought that she had never in her life felt so quietly and completely right about anything. He moved his hat. He had known she was looking. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am very glad I got on that train," she said. He propped himself up on one elbow and looked at her. The afternoon was very quiet and the cottonwood moved lightly above them. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it won't change anything between us. What's already here, that's real regardless." She set the book down on the grass. "Ask me." He sat up all the way and turned to face her, and she recognized the expression he was wearing as one she had not seen before on his face, a kind of undefended openness, vulnerable in the particular way of someone who has decided to be honest at the risk of consequence. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because your uncle arranged it, not because it's expected, not because you have no other options, because you want to. Because I want to spend the rest of my life talking to you and riding with you and watching the way you notice things other people miss. Because the thought of you leaving this place is something I'd rather not have to live with." He paused. "Because I love you, Adelaide. I know it's fast. I know it sounds impossible, but I know what I know." Adelaide felt the whole desert go very still around her. The cottonwood, the blue enormous sky, the red mountains in the distance, the smell of dust and something blooming, all of it perfectly clear and specific. She had spent her whole life having things decided for her, having her future arranged by people who meant well but never once thought to ask her what she wanted. She had gotten on a train to travel 2,000 miles to meet a man she didn't choose, and she had arrived and met someone else entirely, someone who met her train without being the person she was sent to meet, and who had upended every plan in the most magnificent and terrifying and absolutely right way. "Yes," she said. "Orville, yes." He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands with extraordinary gentleness and kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful social performances of her Boston life. It was warm and honest and real, and the desert stretched out around them in every direction, enormous and patient and luminous. Charles was startled but not, Adelaide thought, entirely surprised. He sat with them at supper that evening after they told him, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Your father would have liked you," to Orville, which made Adelaide's eyes fill for the first time since she'd arrived in Arizona, and she looked down at her plate and blinked carefully, and Orville reached over and took her hand under the table, and Charles pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing he could have done. Dona Esperanza, when informed, said something rapid and emphatic in Spanish, hugged Adelaide fiercely, pointed at Orville and said something that made him go slightly pink, and then went back to the kitchen to start making something celebratory. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in the small church at the end of Redrock Flats Main Street, in a ceremony performed by the minister, who was bewildered by the specifics of the situation but professional enough to proceed without expressing it. The church was small and plain and beautiful in the way of things that are exactly what they are without pretense. Sunlight came through 2 high windows and fell across the worn floorboards and the wooden pews. There were wildflowers that Adelaide and Dona Esperanza had gone out early that morning to gather from the desert, arranged in jars along the window sills. Charles walked her down the aisle with great solemnity and the slight redness about his eyes of a man doing his best not to cry. 2 of the other ranch hands, Emmett and Pedro, stood up with Orville in their best shirts, which they had pressed for the occasion with evident effort. Dona Esperanza sat in the front pew and wept openly and without apology, which she said afterward was her right as the woman who had fed them both. Adelaide wore her best dress, which was the dark green traveling dress she had worn when she stepped off the train that first morning, because she had decided it was fitting, and because she loved the look on Orville's face when she came down the church aisle and he saw her in it and remembered. She watched his face all the way down the aisle. He was not the sort of man to perform emotion, but she knew his face well enough now to read what was there behind the steadiness. Something unguarded and complete that she understood was the actual whole of him, offered to her fully, held back not at all. They said their vows in the plain wooden church with the desert outside, and the mountain air coming through the door and the wildflowers in the jars. And when it was done, he kissed her with the same honest warmth as the first time, and Dona Esperanza made a sound of approval, and Emmett and Pedro cheered, and Charles blew his nose into his handkerchief, and Adelaide Ellsworth became Adelaide Vaughn in the Arizona Territory on a bright May morning in 1882. Harlan Boone had, by this point, made his displeasure known around town in the quiet, influential way of a powerful man. He had made some remarks at the bank about Charles Ellsworth's reliability as a man of his word, which created a brief period of social awkwardness that Charles weathered with more dignity than Adelaide had expected, and which ultimately passed without serious damage, partly because the town at large had long experience with Boone's tendency to take professional affront at personal matters. There had also been a moment, about 2 weeks before the wedding, when Boone had stopped Orville in the street outside the general store and said some things that Orville told Adelaide about that evening with the careful thoroughness of a man who believed his wife should know what was happening in her own world. Boone had suggested that Orville was above his station, that he had taken advantage of a young woman who had just arrived and was disoriented, and that a cowboy with no property and no position had no business thinking himself a suitable match for a woman of Adelaide's background. Adelaide had listened to this account very quietly and then said that she would like to speak to Harlan Boone herself. Orville had said, carefully, that she didn't have to do that. She had said, equally carefully, that she knew she didn't have to and that she was going to. The next morning she had gone into town and walked directly into the bank and into Harlan Boone's office, and she had said, in the level and precise voice she had spent her whole life being told to use more softly, that she was a grown woman of 22 who had made a fully considered decision about her own life, that Orville Vaughn was the finest man she had met in any room she had ever been in, and that any insinuation that she had been influenced or manipulated was an insult both to her own intelligence and to Orville's character, and she would appreciate it not being made again. Boone had stared at her for a long moment. She had added that she hoped they could be civil neighbors, as she intended to be in Redrock Flats for the foreseeable future, but that being civil did not require her to pretend that his remarks had been acceptable. She had then said good morning and left. She had told Orville about it at supper, and his expression had moved through several things, landed on something that was very warm and a little undone, and he had said, Adelaide Ellsworth, which was not her name anymore, but she understood what he meant by it. Adelaide Vaughn, she corrected. He had looked at her across the table with everything he felt for her completely visible on his face. Adelaide Vaughn, he had said, like he was testing the sound of it. Yes. After the wedding they settled into the ranch. The plan they had worked out with Charles was straightforward and sensible. Orville would continue his work as the ranch manager, which he was already doing in practice if not in title, and the title and a corresponding partnership in the operation would be formalized over the next 2 years as they built equity and took on more of the operational responsibility. Charles was getting older. He was ready to hand the work to capable hands. He seemed genuinely relieved. Adelaide took over the household management completely and expanded it. She added a vegetable garden behind the house that required significant irrigation work, and which she treated with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything. She began keeping detailed journals of the ranch operations, a practice that turned out to be valuable when disputes arose over water rights and they needed records that demonstrated their established use of the creek. She wrote letters for Charles, managed correspondence with the land office in Tucson, and began teaching the children of 2 of the ranch hands to read in the evenings, because they had no school access and she could not look at an unchooled child without doing something about it. This last enterprise grew within the year into a small school that met 3 mornings a week in the church hall, which the minister was perfectly happy to allow. Adelaide taught 8 children, then 12, then eventually 17, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. She borrowed textbooks from a school in Tucson, wrote to publishers in Boston, and applied with magnificent determination to the territorial government for a formal teaching position, which she received after 6 months and which paid her a small salary of her own. "You are not going to rest," Orville told her one evening, with complete affection, watching her grade papers at the kitchen table. "I'll rest when there's nothing to do," she said. "That will be never." "Yes," she said cheerfully. "I know." He laughed and brought her more coffee and sat beside her at the table to work on the ranch accounts, and they sat together in the lamplight working. And it was one of the hundreds of ordinary perfect evenings that made up the fabric of a life that fit her exactly. Harlan Boone remained a permanent feature of Redrock Flats and an occasional source of professional friction. He did not reform into a warm-hearted figure because this was real life, not a fantasy. He continued to be powerful and businesslike and somewhat cold. But Adelaide's frank confrontation had, interestingly, established a kind of grudging mutual respect. He never again made remarks about Orville's suitability. When Adelaide's school needed a small loan to buy additional textbooks and the territorial funds were delayed, Boone approved the loan at his standard rate, which was not generous but was honest, and that, she supposed, was what she had meant by civil neighbors. The water rights dispute she had expected came in the late summer of 1883, 18 months into their marriage. A speculator named Alcott had bought the land directly upstream from Charles's ranch and had begun diverting the creek in a way that reduced the flow to the lower properties by nearly half. This was a serious problem. Cattle need water. Ranch operations need water. Charles needed water. It was Adelaide who thought to write to a lawyer she had read about in a newspaper, a man in Tucson named Garfield who specialized in territorial land law. While Orville managed the physical crisis of keeping the herd watered through the worst of it, by driving them to an alternate water source 7 miles south that was not being interfered with. The case was not fast and it was not simple, but Garfield was competent. Adelaide's records of the ranch's historical water use were meticulous and went back several years. And by the spring of 1884 the court ruled that Alcott's diversion was unlawful and required its removal. Charles celebrated this outcome with more genuine emotion than Adelaide had ever seen from him, and Orville drove a fence post along the south boundary of the creek diversion site with the particular satisfaction of a man who has won something hard and lasting. In the fall of 1883, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. She told Orville on a Sunday morning when Charles had gone to church. She found him in the barn with the quiet horses in the early cool and she simply told him. He went completely still for a moment, and then he picked her up off the ground and held her, which was not something he did often, not because he was not an affectionate man but because he was careful with his expressions of it, and the completeness of this response told her everything about how much it meant to him. "Are you well?" he asked, setting her down and holding her face in his hands and looking at her with all of that deep particular attention. "I'm wonderful," she said. "I'm tired and a little sick in the mornings, but I'm wonderful." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then held her for a long time in the quiet barn, with the horses moving softly around them. Their son was born in June of 1884, in the bedroom with the window that looked out over the desert toward the Red Mountains, attended by Dona Esperanza and the town's doctor, a good-natured young man named Dr. Calloway who had come out from Missouri 2 years earlier, and who managed the particular drama of a first birth with commendable calm. Orville sat outside the bedroom door for the better part of 8 hours, and was notably less calm than the doctor. When Dona Esperanza came to the door and told him he could come in, he found Adelaide exhausted and triumphant, and holding a baby boy who was red-faced and indignant about his new existence in the way of all newborn creatures. They named him James, for Adelaide's father. Charles Ellsworth met his nephew by name for the first time the next morning, and held him with the careful reverence of an older man being trusted with something irreplaceable. And Adelaide watched from the bed, and felt something complete and specific settle over her life like a quilt pulled into its final perfect position. James Vaughn was a robust baby who grew into an equally robust toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination, which combination his parents recognized would eventually be a tremendous amount of work for everyone involved. He was followed, 18 months later, by a daughter named Clara, who arrived with considerably less drama than James had, and who immediately set about charming every person who came within range of her, which appeared to be an inborn talent. The ranch grew over those years into something that was genuinely theirs. Charles, aging and quietly grateful, transferred formal partnership in 1886, and by 1888 Orville and Adelaide were effectively running the operation. They added to the herd, improved the water infrastructure, and built a small addition to the main house to accommodate the family. Adelaide's school became a formal district school with its own building by 1887, funded partly by territory money, partly by community subscription, and partly by Adelaide simply refusing to accept any other outcome. She was the primary teacher for 3 years and then hired a second teacher, a capable young woman named Miss Holt, who had come west from Ohio specifically seeking teaching work, which Adelaide thought showed excellent judgment. She was pregnant a third time by the winter of 1888. She told Orville on a cold evening when a rare winter rain was drumming on the roof, and they were sitting by the fireplace, James asleep upstairs and Clara in her cradle nearby. He looked at her with exactly the same expression he had worn the first time, that open and undefended joy, and she thought that one of the finest things about this man was that he never armored himself against happiness. "Another one," she said. "Another one," he agreed with deep satisfaction. "You are not remotely surprised," she accused him. "I am completely surprised," he said, not sounding it. She threw a small cushion at him, and he caught it, and Clara stirred in her cradle, and James's voice came down from upstairs asking for water, and the rain kept drumming on the roof, and Adelaide looked at the fire, and at this man she had come west to not marry someone else and found by accident or fate or the particular grace of a bay horse at the end of a train platform. Their third child, another boy they named Thomas, arrived in the summer of 1889. He had Adelaide's auburn hair and Orville's easy temperament, and he would grow up to be the quiet one among the three, the child who sat on fence posts and watched everything and had, Orville said with significant satisfaction, a gift for reading the land. Charles Ellsworth passed peacefully in the autumn of 1891, at 71, in his own bed, with Adelaide holding one hand and Orville holding the other, and the 3 children sleeping down the hall. He had been declining slowly and with minimal complaint for the better part of a year, in the manner of a man who had made his peace with things, and was simply allowing them to conclude. He left the ranch to Adelaide and Orville in a will that was clear and well drawn, which they had helped him write, and he said in those last days that the best thing he had done in his often well-intentioned but not always well-executed life was sending that telegram to Boston about a niece who needed a future. Adelaide kissed his forehead and told him he had no idea what he had started. He had laughed at that, which was, as it happened, the last thing he did, and she thought afterward that this was exactly right. They buried him on the ranch, on the high ground where you could see both the town and the mountains, under a juniper tree that was already old when the ranch was built. Orville made the marker himself from good wood, cut and shaped with care. Dona Esperanza cooked for 3 days in the way she had of expressing everything she could not say, and the whole of Redrock Flats came out for the service, because Charles had been their neighbor for 15 years and had done mostly good in that time, in the quiet, steady way of a man who was not remarkable but was reliable, which was its own kind of contribution. In the spring of 1892, a decade exactly after Adelaide had stepped off the train into Orville Vaughn's unexpected gravity, Redrock Flats held its first proper Founders' Day celebration, which was not very accurately named since the town was 30 years old, but the enthusiasm for civic festivity was genuine, and the occasion was taken. There were races and a pie contest, and a dance that evening in the barn of the Caldwell place, the largest barn in the district. Adelaide danced with Orville in the lantern-lit barn while James, now 7 and already certain of his own importance, danced with Clara in the corner in an exaggerated imitation of the adults, and Thomas sat on a hay bale and watched everything with his father's calm, observing eyes. The band was playing something that moved through the warm barn air and out through the open doors into the desert night, and Adelaide had her hand in Orville's and her head tilted up toward his face, and she thought, "This is what it feels like when a life is actually yours. Not arranged, not managed, not settled for. Yours. What are you thinking?" he asked. He always knew when she had gone somewhere particular in her own head. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. "Do you know what I thought when I saw you on that platform?" she said. "No," he said, which was true. She had never told him this specifically. "I thought you were the most alarming person I had ever seen in my life," she said, "and that I was going to have to be very careful." He laughed, warm and low. "How did that plan work out?" "Catastrophically," she said. "In the best possible way." He pulled her slightly closer, and they danced in the lantern light, and the warm Arizona evening wrapped itself around everything, and the children played and the music went on, and somewhere in the desert the coyotes were calling to each other across the dark. She had been sent west to marry a banker, and she had arrived at a train platform in the spring of 1882, and a cowboy had been standing at the end of it with a bay horse and dark coffee eyes, and a voice like the open land itself, unhurried and genuine, and exactly what she had not known she was looking for. By noon of that first day, the train was already gone, and the life she had been sent west to live had been replaced entirely by the one she was actually meant to have, and Adelaide Vaughn, who had once been Adelaide Ellsworth of Boston with her trunk full of appropriate dresses and her heart full of appropriate dread, could not imagine any version of events that would have made her happier. She stood on the porch of her ranch house later that night after they had brought the sleeping children home and settled them, stood in the dark desert air with the stars overhead that she now knew the names of, constellations Orville had taught her lying on their backs in the summer grass 3 months after they had met, and barely able to keep from laughing at each other for reasons that had nothing to do with stars. And she thought about the telegram, and the train, and the green dress, and the platform. She thought about the cowboy at the end of it. Orville came out to the porch and stood beside her and looked up at the same stars. "Come inside," he said. "It's late." "In a minute," she said. He waited, which was entirely characteristic of him. He was the most patient man she had ever known, and she had understood almost from the beginning that this patience was not passivity but strength, the settled strength of someone who knows what he has and does not feel the need to chase it or clutch it but simply stands beside it. She reached out and took his hand in the dark. "Do you ever think about how close it came to being completely different?" she said. "If Charles had come to the station himself, if you had been out on the range that morning, if I had—" "Adelaide," he said. "Yes. I don't think about that," he said. "I think about this." He squeezed her hand. "What is?" She looked up at the stars one more moment, and then turned and went inside with him, through the door that opened into the lamplit warmth of the house that was theirs, past the children's rooms where small breathing shapes were visible in the dark, and the smell of Dona Esperanza's bread still warm from the day, and the books on the shelves and the accounts ledger on the desk, and the dried wildflowers on the windowsill that Clara had picked from the desert last week with tremendous ceremony, and everything that made up the specific texture of a life that was real and chosen and completely, unmistakably hers. And the door closed behind them, and the desert went on being enormous and luminous and patient in the dark, and the stars turned slowly overhead the way they always had, and Redrock Flats slept its quiet frontier sleep, and in a small room at the end of the hall, Thomas Vaughn slept with one arm flung above his head and breathed steadily in the way of children who are safe and warm and entirely unaware of the magnificent accident of love that had arranged their existence, while outside the bay horse, old now but comfortable in his familiar corral, stood in the moonlight with the patience of a creature that had always known it was exactly where it was supposed to be.